I'd like to acknowledge Australians' First Nation people as the traditional custodians of the land, and for this episode in particular, the Wadandi people. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging.
To me, success in agriculture is about identifying those strengths so that we can, whether it's wine or anything else, we can really make the most pure foods humanly possible in a sustainable way.
This is Over a Glass. I'm Shanteh Wale. Bruce Jukes is the mastermind behind Domaine Naturaliste. He is a true creative at heart with a deep understanding of the soils and unique characteristics of his special corner in Wilyabrup, Margaret River. His wines sing with purity, joy, and remarkable detail, and I'm thrilled that he's joining me today. Hi, Bruce.
Shanteh, how are you?
I'm really well, and it's lovely to have you on the podcast finally. I've long been a fan of your wines, and I felt like I knew something about you before, we've even met in person. And I think that is a testament to just how loudly your wines speak.
Oh, thank you. Well, I've sort of been enjoying working with wine for quite a while now, and it's just a sort of a lovely thing to be involved with because of its sort of creativity and expressiveness.
Well, that's for sure. Tell me a little bit about how you decided and that wine might be for you, and let's go back a ways in time. Where did you grow up, and what's your first memory of wine?
Well, I grew up on the coast in Perth, in a little suburb called City Beach, and my parents always enjoyed a glass of wine, and so that was something they always sort of had as part of their lifestyle. But probably my first sort of entry to wine was almost nothing to do with wine. And that I remember as a little kid with a couple of friends, school friends in grade 6, that we had a Sultana grapevine growing in the backyard of our house where I grew up. And myself and a couple of friends would grab those grapes in our hands, squeeze them, put the juice into little master food spice jars, and then we'd take them off to school and we'd pop them on our sort of desk, and we would sort of watch the juice would sort of clarify, then it would sort of start settling and start fermenting after that, and then sort of carbonate itself, and we were sort of impressed about how did this sort of magic happen. And because we were effectively making sparkling wine, because at that time we kept the lids on, and of course we're probably very lucky we didn't actually explode the bottles, and so that was just fascinating. How did this stuff sort of occur? And that's probably, looking back, it's towards the very beginnings of my interests that were probably more so in sort of, I guess, the microbiology of it than actually the wine.
Wow. I mean, I've heard of kids doing a lot of strange things in school, and it is amazing what fascinates us at certain ages. I remember grinding up clay and mixing it with moisturizer and trying to sell it in the playground as foundation, which was problematic once it dried on your face. But that is incredible. I can't believe from such a young age you were interested in the science of something that, it just boggles the mind that you were thinking about that, but that's really cool.
Well, it was just the fascination of it. And of course, in grade 6, of course, you're not thinking about wine or anything like that, but you're just thinking, hey, this is kind of pretty cool. And then I guess as a kid too, I'd always loved plants. And for example, when I was a young fella still at school, I got a job in a nursery in Perth, and my job, of course, was, stacking shelves with bags of fertiliser and cleaning things. But they had this beautiful greenhouse there, and one of the things I would do would cut little tips off some of the plants, particularly like the monsterias, which are an inside sort of house plant, dip them sort of in a hormone powder, and then sort of pop them into a clear agar solution that they also sold there. And I had a little sort of corner of the greenhouse that I was propagating all these plants from shoot tip cuttings. And of course, this was nothing to do with my job. It was just kind of being a little geek and seeing if I could do it. And so probably there are a couple of sort of things early in my life that when I look backwards to how I got interested in winemaking and grape growing and soils, they're probably some of the catalytic things at the beginning.
Absolutely fascinating. Now, tell me, City Beach is where you grew up, but you were in a state that had some beautiful wines. When was it that you decided to actually make the decision and go and study your master's degree in viticulture and oenology at the University of California?
Well, it was even going back a little bit before that. In my first life, with my sort of interest in the soils, plants, and of course the microbiology, I started studying agricultural science. And then almost halfway through that journey, I worked out that the wine was the perfect way to integrate the soils, plants, but also very important, sort of the lifestyle. And so at the time in Western Australia, there was literally nowhere that you could study winemaking. I really enjoyed the agriculture side of things, so I went through and completed that degree. And part of that was a project that I worked with our local Department of Agriculture and the University of Western Australia on a grapevine sort of nutrition and fermentation trial. And during that, I read so many papers that had come out of the University of California, Davis, that after I sort of started and after my sort of first vintage in Margaret River, I ended up working as a researcher at UC Davis in the lab of Professor Cornelius O, who had written so many of these papers. And I think it was at that time at Davis, I sort of realised it was kind of like a melting pot of international students, particularly sort of in the wine department. And very importantly, too, I realised in the early 90s, with an Australian accent on an American university campus, I could pretty well get away with blue murder. And so that set my sights on actually returning there to enter the grad school in 93, because it actually took me another couple of years to get enough funding and scholarships to be allowed to enter that beautiful country of America.
I cannot imagine the huge change it was. You said that you could get away with murder. What was the kind of impression that you first had when you went over there, and what struck you as different from growing up in Australia?
Well, I was probably quite sort of overwhelmed because Western Australia, Perth and Margaret River is a fairly isolated part of the world. And I guess what struck me with all my sort of contemporaries there at UC Davis was they were from different parts of the world, all beautiful sort of parts of the world, and it was their passion to learn about wine. But parallel to that passion was probably the social nature of what we do and just all of the sort of cultural things associated with the wine that probably made it a richer experience than actually all the technical side. And just seeing how people were so passionate about showing some wines from their home country or presenting different sort of foods that they would cook at home, it just made it such an exciting place.
Yeah, and I've heard that. I think as Aussies, we often, in the past especially, looked to the rest of the world to see, and, taking that big one flight that to get us, wherever we're going in the world, it's usually often quite expensive. And then realizing that, hey, wine's a serious thing and people take it seriously and they're very passionate. And yeah, this could be a future.
Oh, look, absolutely it was a future, and I was already sort of really ensconced in into the wine industry, but this was the absolute sealer of the deal, and even to the point that the professor's lab, Professor Cornelius O, was kind enough, he drove all the way to San Francisco, which was a couple of hours' drive from UC Davis, to pick me up from the airport, and then let me stay at his house for the first week till I got settled. And I just thought, my God, that's so incredibly generous and so incredibly nice that this amazing professor who's head of a department would do this for someone else. And it was just one of those sort of indications about the passionate nature of the wine industry and the people involved in it.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So how long did you stay in California for?
Well, I went to school there, and then in '94 I got a little sort of holiday job working for Francis Ford Coppola at his vineyard, which is the famous sort of vineyard Inglenook in Rutherford and Napa Valley. And that sort of 3-month sort of harvest job sort of turned into 5 years. And so I didn't sort of return to sunny Margaret River until sort of early 1998.
Wow. I mean, that's a big, really, in a formative year, that's a big time in someone's life. When did you feel the pull back to Australia?
Well, it was kind of fascinating because I actually loved Margaret River, and I also loved Napa Valley, and I had so many sort of friends because after going to school and working there, that I was sort of very happy there. But in my former years, I'd completed 3 vintages with a beautiful, beautiful Chardonnay producer in Margaret River called Piero. And so I had the opportunity to come back to Piero as Mike Peterkin's winemaker and general manager. And as well, I sort of had the draw that all of my family, or most of my family, were based in Perth. And so it was fascinating because Francis Coppola had offered me the job of winemaker for his non-estate wines. And so I had a lot of sort of soul searching to do, but I'm really delighted that I had those Californian experiences. But equally, the excitement and the freedoms of being in what I sort of think a little bit as the Wild West are also quite compelling and exciting.
The world is full of beautiful places. I mean, I'm not surprised that you chose to be back in Margaret River. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts on when you decided that, being a winemaker was for you and how you went about that once you're back in Australia, because you were also a trained agronomist as well.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things that I did was, and literally it was actually 25 years ago, sort of went out independently and wanted to really focus on the grape growing side of things with all of the agronomic aspects, integrate that with the winemaking side of things, as well as with the cultural side of the wines and how they integrate with our lives. And so I started a consulting business which joined all of that together. And then I think winemakers are a breed of people who are probably nearly as temperamental as chefs, meaning they sort of go, no, I want to do it my way. And so after a couple of years of working with sort of grape growing and working as a consultant with winemaking, I suddenly realized that I actually had enough people that I was working with that I could actually draw all of that together at a single location. And so it was probably 21 years ago I built a winery called Naturaliste Vintners and set that up as a custom crush winemaking place where I'd hopefully created an environment where we had some really talented winemakers, beautiful equipment, and all of the infrastructure there was effectively a skin over how I wanted the wine sort of process to flow. And then it took quite a few years, and I think it was 2012 before Domaine Naturaliste was born. And that was an evolution that started, catalysed probably by the fact that my two boys, Tim and Oscar, could get in and out of the car, put their own seatbelts on, and my wife, Wendy, had a little bit more time. And so that was the perfect time for us to go into the sort of bottled branded wine ourselves with Domaine Naturaliste.
And how did you, I mean, having a kid being able to get in the car and put their seatbelt on is a huge game changer. But how did you find the reception and the community within Margaret River for starting your own brand? It is a competitive world, so it's interesting to know kind of what was that first new scope of starting a business like?
It was exciting, and it was probably an extension of my custom crush business, but it was an extension that probably allowed me to push stylistic elements a little further, take more risks, and pursue some things that you probably wouldn't do with custom crush. And it was the huge embracement by fellow winemaking friends, almost going, Bruce, why have you waited 25 years into your life journey to start a wine brand? But I'm kind of glad I did, because I've had friends who have started wine brands, made the most amazing wines, but they didn't quite have the other communication lines in the supply chain, those sort of resources settled, and they if they'd kept their powder dry a little longer, it might have been a very different circumstance.
Yeah, that age-old saying of time spent in reconnaissance is seldom wasted. I think there's so many facets to this industry, isn't there? And being able to just make good wine simply isn't enough. There is so many other factors and know-how, and if you don't know it yourself, you certainly need the right people on board. So I think all of that other information you gathered is definitely, leads to the success of your wine brand today, that's for sure.
Well, I'm certainly not averse to taking risks and doing things, but I guess if you look at the time span and the evolution prior to that, I guess there's a conservative side within me too.
I think I kind of see that a little bit in your portfolio from your discovery direction and your flagship range, that there is still this curiosity and joy of discovery with a lot of your wines. And then I also see this real honing in of skill and this real artful detail in some of those top end wines. But I can still see that you are tickled pink by the process of making wine. And I don't think you can always say that about everybody. You can't always see that they're still happy to keep learning as they're going along the way, do you think?
Well, I sort of find this, and I'm so lucky that I've found this passion, this hobby of mine that actually is or has become my life and my job. And I sort of think of every glass of wine as absolutely critically important, and that's my job to do that. For everyone else, I just want them to enjoy a glass of wine. But I love really trying to understand the composition of the fruit and what you can have from that fruit from different locations, and how it can be translated through to that final food, being that beautiful wine, by running with the strengths of its personalities and not pushing against them. And then the other exciting bit that I've probably got a little better at understanding as I've got older is thinking how those styles then integrate with what I often describe as our Australian coastal foods and just how it balances out. And for example, 30 years ago, we might have prioritised absolute amounts of flavour in our Chardonnay wines, and so they were perhaps more robust styles with higher alcohols that might have needed balancing, for example, with acidity. Whereas now I think we've got a societal expectation that we want these sort of aromatic wines, all natural acidity with moderate levels of alcohol, so that they're really sort of fragrant and engaging. And so we've got different set of criteria to that absolute sort of flavour and power that we did many years ago. And seeing and trying to understand that sort of evolution in the expectations in the wines, I find fascinating.
I find it, I'm someone like you, Bruce, who finds it impossible to think about wine without food, because I just think that that's how we consume and enjoy it. And so it's always something, not far from my mind. You talked a little bit about working with the strengths of characters of the varietals you're working with, but I've also heard you talk about that with the environment as well. What's your approach kind of in the vineyard? And you're in a beautiful little spot, Wilyabrup. Tell us a little bit also about where you are.
We farm and have our little vineyard in Wilyabrup, which is the northern precinct of Margaret River. And so we're probably 7 kilometres inland, so east of the beautiful Indian Ocean, and about 25 kilometres south of Cape Naturaliste, the northern peninsula or cape that defines Margaret River, with the southern cape another 75 kilometres south being Cape Lewin. And so we're on a gentle, the top of a gentle ridge, and effectively and historically, going back a long time, between that ridge it was literally an uplift of granite rock. And it's quite simply that granite rock that has rotted or decomposed in place that's formed all of these beautiful soils. And so we have these sort of truly ancient granitic soils that are quite moderate in their water holding capacity, quite moderate in their fertility, because so many of the primary minerals and nutrients have been leached over time. But it sets up kind of a nice part of the world for grape growing, because when that's integrated with the very gentle maritime climate of the region, it creates a very long but very gentle growing season. And sort of surprise, surprise, parallel with that is all the endemic sort of biodiversity in the area. And that's I kind of like when I sort of explain things, well, that biodiversity isn't there at randomness. It's there because it's a gentle sort of climate that's quite sympathetic to a number of plants. And so I just try and understand that soil, and because it's so old, so ancient, it's also quite fragile. And so we work quite extensively on getting the foundations right. And so we put a lot of effort into growing different sort of cover crops between the vines and working on what we call no-tillage systems. And so our cover crops, we might grow half a dozen different strains of subterranean clover, half a dozen different strains of ryegrass. And of course, with that complexity, there's a little bit of biodiversity, but there are clovers that are flowering at different times. The clovers have the ability, as do the ryegrasses, to select little patches which work better or worse for them. And it just gives, enriched nitrogen into the soil by the subclovers. And of course, the subclovers set their seed underground, so it's quite a good perpetuating system. The clovers are also selected because they're quite shallow rooted, so that in our climate they've gone through their life cycles, and as the soil moisture sort of dropping towards Christmas, the clovers have completed their life cycle and die off, which is great because at that time of the year we then want to preserve our soil moisture. And parallel with that, with the ryegrasses that sort of deep place organic matter into the profile, and combined with sort of grazing sheep, we have a pretty good system which kind of results in basically, a 35 hectare earthworm farm. And having those foundations for the soil are great. And also probably very thankful for the likes of people like John Gladstones, who not only was the climatologist that identified Margaret River, but he was also a geneticist who was quite expert with the clovers and really helped establish these concepts of these sustainable systems decades and decades ago, before people were talking about sustainability.
Yeah, way ahead of his game. Rest in peace. Tell me a little bit about your understanding of agronomy. Does that teach you how to work with nature, being that it's different agricultural products? Is it always kind of a practice of working with nature or working against it?
Well, I think sustainability is about working with the strengths of nature and what works with your system. And even, for example, if I was growing wheat and that wheat was beautifully suited to noodles, well, make noodles with it. Don't try and turn it into bread, because you're pushing things in the wrong direction. And so, to me, success in agriculture is about identifying those strengths so that we can, whether it's wine or anything else, we can really make the most pure foods humanly possible in a sustainable way. And part of that purity in the food is getting those raw ingredients right so they can translate to that food without manipulation or without intervention. And that's where I think success in working with biological systems comes from.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about, firstly, just your approach with Chardonnay. I could have picked any of the wines you made, in particular Sauvignon Blanc, which floored me the first time I had your Sauvage style. Holy moly, what a wine.
Oh, thank you.
I was like, how can there be this much flavour and texture and nuance in this bottle? It's just sublimely delicious and interesting. And I challenge any snooty sommelier out there that, thinks they've tasted complex Sauvignon Blanc to try that wine, because it will change their opinion. But I didn't choose that. I chose Chardonnay for the reason that I wanted to hear a little bit about your approach with the artists and the purist styles, because we talk about Margaret River and as a region, as a regional style. And here you have two very, very distinctively different wines, but equally delicious and fine. So tell me a little bit about your approach with those two styles of Chardonnay.
The approach very much comes back to the fruit. And with the artist Chardonnay, when the artist really referring to a style which uses the wild yeast from the outside of the fruit, and then another layer on top of that is quite literally a full malolactic fermentation. Well, that beautiful Gingin Chardonnay is from the very cool south of Margaret River, from the Carradale area. And so that fruit can go through the wild ferment, the full malolactic fermentation, and in my opinion, or at this point in time history. But after that, it still has a lovely natural acid balance with that completely unrestricted sort of ferment. And through the journey of that wine, it is actually sort of batonaged. We do play it nice music though, Shanteh, but we'll batonage it and it sort of helps it grow. And that sort of batonage over time seems to put in some of the slightly sort of funky, possibly like cordite, flinty sort of characters that I hope embed in the wine. Then the juxtaposition, I guess, to that is the purest Chardonnay. And the purest is really referring to the very pure translation of the fruit to the wine. And although it's actually the same site as the Artis, which is the Gingin clone, the purists are some of the beautiful Dijon clones, primarily 76 and 95. And quite simply, in the similar sort of environment, these Dijon clones reach a physiological ripeness, meaning nice flavours, natural acid balance at lower sugar levels than what the Gingin does. And so it means with the purists, I think I can harvest it at these sort of lower gravities or maturities, if you like, but it's perfectly ripe. And so it's set up for this uber pure translation, because if I did the malolactic fermentation on this fruit, it wouldn't be balanced in natural acidity. So don't do it. It's not sustainable. It doesn't make sense. And so Purus is also barrel fermented, but in very, very low toast French oak. And the oak has had just enough sort of heat energy in it so the wood is not sort of sappy or resinous. But I'm really looking for textural infill from that oak in the Purus. And then, of course, there is zero batonnage in the Purus, because that batonnage is lovely that it builds texture, but it can also create some of those flinty, funky compounds that are part of Artis, but I don't want them in Purus. And so it's actually after about 10 months with no batonnage, no malolactic in the Purus, it'll go to tank. I'll do some batonnage in tank, but of course the batonnage in tank, I'm not getting any oxygen entering, so I'm not getting those reductive characters. And the whole point of these two wines was to hopefully just, well, A, be able to put them on the table and have some fun, but B, show that the two different crops or different ingredients should have very different interpretations, because what you get is very different. And that's really the summation of Artis and Purus. And I actually thought in the beginning with Artis that I would be probably completely crucified by having a style that had these malolactic elements, because certainly at the time there was a lot of focus on wines that the story of sort of absolute fruit purity was the most important thing. But of course, these wines are also made for a degree of fun by me and to keep me going and entertained. And it's been quite fascinating, particularly with older Australians who remember Chardonnays with the elements of sort of butterscotch, brioche, toast, and think of that as a proper Chardonnay, and they have these most incredible sort of aroma flavour memories. And so it's with a lot of older people that pick up on these notes in the Artis, where I hope I've captured some of that emotion and passion from those food memories, but showcased it in a modern interpretation that I believe is sustainable and suits the crop.
I think that's exactly what you have done and you've succeeded in doing. What I was amazed about by those two Chardonnays was they did not feel forced in any way. You know, the Artis had beautiful richness, that little bit of kind of firecracker flintiness, but it was so well balanced and creamy and mouth filling without being too muscular. And then the Purus had this slippery, really slinky sensation with lots of minerality, but without feeling austere. And I just thought, man, these two wines are both really characteristic and confident, but all the detail was there as well. And I agree, they are such modern interpretations of almost yesteryear nostalgia plus where we're going, where we're at now. I just thought they're just two really amazing wines, and to come from the same estate, to put them on the table, to involve everyone in the conversation of what Chardonnay is all about, which is the lights and shades, it's just done so well.
Oh, thank you. It is exciting, and it is actually that light and shade on the bunches as they develop. And for example, if the bunches have too much sun, just like people, they will develop sunscreen. And while we say develop melanin in our skins in response to sun, if the Chardonnay has too much sunlight, it'll be too tannic. And so all of those sort of agronomic things in the farming, ensuring it has just enough cover that it can develop beautiful flavours but not get high levels of tannin, are important. And probably as well not to sort of be greedy, not to try and sort of take too much from biological systems and push them too hard. And even sort of extending that through to the winemaking, where we want to take the beautiful juice from the Chardonnay, but kind of not take too much. It's often that little bit that you sort of leave in the skins that can go to compost, back to the vineyard, that actually helps define and showcase what you have taken. And we try with these wines to have a huge degree of honesty and call the sort of juices the pure white hearts. And so it's actually the hardest pressings aren't put in there, and the pure white hearts go to make these wines, and that's what they are, with a completely unconditioned juice, because quite honestly, that's what it is. And if you don't sort of appreciate that sort of subtle phenolic tension, that's fine. But that phenolic tension is what this pure juice is, and I'm kind of happy and really think that honesty is important to me, and the authenticity of what that wine is.
I love hearing you talk about your approach, but also how you talk about land care and also about just plants and species, because it's very clear that you love what you do, but you also love the natural world, and that really comes across. Bruce, I'd love to know a little bit about your palate and what you like to drink. If you could only drink 3 beverages for the rest of your life, what would they be and why?
Well, if there were 3 beverages, that gives me a lot of scope as opposed to 3 specific ones. But I am just sort of in love and sort of energised by Chardonnay, and particularly sort of the wines of Margaret River and the wines of Chablis. I just find zippy, energising, imbibing, motivating. And the other ones that I'm just in love with are an exploration of Syrah, and particularly some of the amazing centuries-long traditions that you can capture in a single bottle of Hermitage, and just the attention to detail that I know goes into those wines that, God, since sort of studying at Davis with Jean-Louis Chave, to be able to follow those wines through is truly amazing. And probably my final one stemmed that a couple of years ago had the most amazing trip with a group of 8 friends from Margaret River staying in Tuscany. And so I'm very much on this Chianti sort of Brunello phase of my life, and the beautiful wines. But beautiful wines kind of aren't enough. It's the beautiful wines and the association with all that beautiful produce, the area, the producers there that are, they're probably three of my faves at the moment. I go through phases in my life of loving different wines.
Absolutely. And it's such a cruel question because I often say to people, this is just a question for today. It can change tomorrow. And I agree. Loving wine is such a journey and it changes all the time. And there's so much, so many varietals and so many different shapes depending on where they're from that we can change our mind and go through different phases. And isn't that awesome?
Oh, look, I think it's great. It's a little bit like you don't want to eat at the same restaurant every night of your life. Diversity is, it is a lot of fun.
Yeah, I agree. Bruce, I knew I was going to love our chat. The beautiful Erica Shinnie was the person to talk about what a legend you are. And indeed, I agree. Shout out to Shinnie. And thank you so much for joining me. I love your wines and I really can't wait till we get to have a drink in person and talk a little bit further.
Looking forward to it. You're a rock star. Thank you so much, Shanteh.
Thank you, Bruce, and cheers to you.
Ciao, ciao.
This is Over a Glass. I'm Shanteh Wale. Stay tuned for more stories from the world of wine and drinks. Listen in every Thursday on your podcast app. Follow us on Instagram at overaglasspod and contact us at overaglass@deepintheweeds.com.au.